Hello, grade 11s. Today's screencast is about the provisional government and dual power and why the dual power ended and why the provisional government lost power. So we'll be referring to 6.3. We'll also look at the homework questions and the reading for the story of the provisional government and the fall of the provisional government. So why was there a second revolution after the first one in Russia? That was the February Revolution. For that, we need to realize that Lenin was a major factor and he was one of the guiding forces for the second revolution. And we're going to see that it was both mistakes and weaknesses on the part of the provisional government and maybe a certain amount of events that were beyond their control. Okay, let's begin. Let's look first at the provisional government's first actions. They were popular in some ways. They freed political prisoners. They gave an 8-hour day for industrial workers. And the Tsar's secret police, the Okhrana, they abolished. They also promised a new constituent assembly and new elections. And this constituent assembly would make the constitution for the government. However, they had some less popular actions. And those were that they stayed in the war, they would later even launch offensives, there was no land reform, and there was a problem that they had to share authority or have a dual authority with the Petrograd Soviet as well as the problem of Order Number 1. And here we can see Lenin here promising those things that the government did not promise. He promised peace, land, and bread, and he also declared that all power should go to the Soviets. Now, we're going to see more about Lenin later. This is Lenin arriving on the train in Russia in 1917, well after the February Revolution. But let's go back now to the provisional government and one of its problems. Here you can see the Constituent Assembly, definitely not upper class. There's workers there, there's an injured soldier, there's women involved, and it really had a broad support from the workers, soldiers, and sailors in what would become the Soviet Union. Order Number 1 was given by not by the provisional government, but was given by the Petrograd Soviet, and in particular, clauses 3 and 4 were particularly problematic for the provisional government. Because in 3 they said, in all their political actions, units are subordinated to the Soviet of Workers and Soldiers Deputies, that's the Petrograd Soviet, and their own committees. In addition, number 4, all orders issued by the Military Commission of the State Duma shall be carried out, except those which run counter to the orders and decrees issued by the Soviet of the Workers and Soldiers Deputies. That's the Petrograd Soviet. So right here in Order Number 1, we can see that the Petrograd Soviet is putting itself above the provisional government in terms of commanding the armed forces, and this will create problems later. So, with the establishment of dual power here, we can see representatives of the Duma, and you can see this is quite a different group than this group we saw on the page before here, where it's much more working class or lower class members of Russia, whereas in the provisional government, you can see Kerensky over here in this. Let me just pull up on the pointer here. Over in this area, he was a member of both. He was a member of the provisional government, which came from the Duma, and he's a member of the Petrograd Soviet. But the rest of these gentlemen were not. They appointed themselves as the new provisional government in March 1917. This government included liberals, moderate socialists, constitutional Democrats, and other moderates. The liberals would be a lot like people in Canada today, or say the middle of the road in Germany. So that's sort of their political view. It had a chairman, a Prince Lvov. So already we see upper class, the Minister of War, Guchenkov, the Foreign Minister, Milyonko, and Kerensky, who I mentioned before, the only member who was a member of the provisional government, and the Petrograd Soviet was the Minister of Justice. Now, the Petrograd Soviet, or another word might be an elected committee, their composition, they're made up of Mensheviks, who were communists, social revolutionaries, that was the group that wanted to see a change in Russia that related to the peasants. And then finally, there was some Bolsheviks there, and they were also communists, but they were different than the Mensheviks in that they wanted to force a revolution, whereas the Mensheviks wanted to work with the provisional government and allow a more modern industrial society to develop in Russia, which would then allow them to have a revolution. Now, the Soviets sprang up all across Russia through 1917. They were formed in factories and military bases, and there are even rural Soviets. And in June 1917, the All-Russian Congress of Soviets met in Petrograd, and we can see that representatives were sent from over 350 towns, villages, and military bases. Now, why didn't the Petrograd Soviet take power? They had Order Number 1 is issued, but they didn't attempt to take control. That's where they said they had power over the military. The workers and soldiers of Russia saw the Petrograd Soviet as their sort of central representative to whom they sent representatives. They saw it as more legitimate than the provisional government, which was upper class, maybe detached from them and had appointed themselves. But the Petrograd Soviet didn't feel it was time to take power, or maybe they were cautious in seizing power. Now, there is Sukhanov's view on page 190 in Waller 6.3, and I'll read that to you. Nikolai Sukhanov, an early Soviet leader, later gave his view on why the Soviet did not take control. Our revolution lacked both the material power and the indispensable prerequisites for an immediate socialist transformation of Russia. The Soviet democracy had to entrust the power to the propertied elements, its class enemy, without whose participation it could not now master the technique of administration, nor deal with the forces of Tsarism and the bourgeoisie united against it. So that was his view. They weren't really quite ready. So there were two powers, two governments, dual power, one on one side of the palace you see here, and one on this side of the palace, the Tauride Palace that you see here, and they're both sharing power in Russia. Now, according to Waller on page 190, the Soviet leadership of the Petrograd Soviet actually feared the responsibility of governing. So an interesting view in that way. In the terms of dual power, in order to get it, the provisional government granted to Russia a general amnesty for political prisoners, something I mentioned before that was very popular. They gave basic civil liberties, things like freedom of the press. There was an abolition of legal inequalities based on class, religion, and nationality. The people of Russia were given the right to organize trade unions. They also met during the day with their workers' committee and things in the factory. There was also the promise of a constituent assembly to write a new constitution, which is essentially the rules for the country. So how would they set up the country? How would power to be divided? What responsibilities would there be? That was going to be written by this new body called the Constituent Assembly. Now, the Petrograd Soviet did not challenge the authority of the provisional government. Now, the Petrograd provisional government had some support from the masses, but you need to remember they did not push for land reform, and in part this was because they didn't have the legal right to do so. They had not been elected. They didn't feel it was right to do so. There's also the fact that members of the provisional government and groups they represented didn't want their land taken away or redistributed. And so this is what existed during the period of dual authority. Now, there were problems between the provisional government and the Petrograd Soviet. One was that they had different visions of the future for Russia. One, with the Petrograd Soviet, is looking for a peoples-based or a peasant-based change, maybe even as far as an abolition of banks and maybe personal property and nationalizing land. One must also remember the provisional government did not have traditional means of controlling opposition. They got rid of the police. And also with Order Number 1, they did not have ultimate control of the military if things got ugly. And they also had that unpopular decision to continue the war. And a result of that we can see in the picture right here. So, problems with the provisional government? They tried to satisfy both the upper and lower classes in Russia and managed to satisfy neither, as you've seen in your reading. There was a feeling the provisional government was moving to the left with changes in leadership, so the right and the moderates weren't as happy. And with the unpopular war effort, this could be seen in terms of desertions. And this picture that you can see right above me here is of two deserters being threatened by another soldier. From 1914 to 1917, there's a record of 195,000 desertions from the army, while from March to May 1917, 365,000. In part, that's due to the unpopularity of the war. It's also due in part because peasants were hearing that land was being taken over by local people, taken away from landowners, and they didn't want to miss out on the chance to get land for themselves. Now, things deteriorated for the provisional government, and they launched a very unpopular June offensive to try and push the German forces out of Russia. You remember that from an earlier screencast. They captured hundreds of kilometers of Russia, and this offensive ended in a disaster with 60,000 killed. There were demonstrations in the street by workers, sailors, and soldiers. Here you can see some pictures of some of the rioting going on in Petrograd. The people lying down have been shot as they're trying to disperse the riots. Ultimately, the Bolsheviks were blamed. Not so much because they organized it. Some say they tried to take advantage of it once it was happening. But Lenin and the other leaders definitely knew that this was not the time to have a revolution. They did not have the support. They did not have the organization. So it was not the time to have a coup and take over the government. But because the Bolsheviks were blamed by Kerensky, they were outlawed and driven underground due to that blame. Lenin fled. And now, at this point, in the July days of 1917, it appears the Bolsheviks are on their way out. And so that comes to the question, are they done? Just like Hitler, who rose, and just like Castro, who rose, there's a combination of the skill and talents of the Bolsheviks, plus some lucky opportunities. Kornilov's attempted coup. This is Kornilov, above me right here. And he took 6 regiments and decided he was going to take over the government. At one point, he was allied with Kerensky, the leader of the provisional government, but then Kerensky got worried about what was happening, and Kerensky needed help. And he needed to call upon the one group he didn't want to call upon for help. He had to call upon the Soviet and the banned and outlawed Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks and supporters of the Soviet were given weapons, and now the Bolsheviks were allowed to operate again, and they did not return the weapons, which set things up for a later coup. The trains carrying the troops of Kornilov were stopped, and the railway workers began to talk to them and debate with them. And in one way, in a sense, TOK stopped this coup because the railway workers argued with the soldiers that why were they attempting to overthrow the Soviet when the Soviet actually represented them. And you can get another example of how bad things were getting in Russia. You can see in March, the ration was 1 pound of bread per day. By April, it was 1/8 of a pound. And then we get into the July days. September, things were improving again. They were getting 1/2 pound. And by October, people were down to 1/4 of a pound. They're hungry. They're unhappy with the provisional government. So they're going to be willing to listen to the Bolsheviks. And they might be willing also to have a spontaneous revolution as they'd had in February. So let's look at the continuing problems with the provisional government. The lower classes, as we can see, have become alienated from the government. The war was still on. There was no land reform. There were no elections properly scheduled. There was little improvement in working conditions. And the prices, which had been very high in January 1917 and prompted that revolution, they were 300% higher from 1914 levels. And in October, when Lenin felt it was time to seize power, prices had gone up by 755%. And in August, there were changes in the factories. Workers were allowed to be fired, and workers' committees were not allowed to meet during the workday, as they had before. All of this meant that the lower classes and the workers to whom the Bolsheviks appealed did not give their support to the provisional government, and they were not pleased with what was happening. Now, to go back to what had happened and why Lenin hadn't appealed to these people, we have to look at the April thesis that he brought with him, in a sense, on the trains that came from Switzerland through Germany to Russia. Simply, his message was bread, peace, and land. And he also wanted all power to the Soviets. Additionally, there'd be no cooperation with the provisional government. Because he saw them too closely allied with and being part of the bourgeoisie and the upper classes. Plus, if he didn't ally with them, then they couldn't be blamed for their mistakes. Hello. Yes, I have changed my clothes. We had some technical difficulties there. So just cut off partway through looking at Lenin's April thesis. And remember, it's bread, peace, and land, all power to the Soviets, no cooperation with the provisional government. And when the revolution comes, the Bolsheviks will lead it, in part because of the April thesis. So Lenin travels to Russia from Switzerland by way of Germany. The Germans send him there on a sealed train. Trotsky hears of the revolution and the changes in February, and he'll return from New York. Remember, this train with Lenin is sealed just because they're afraid of the dangers of communism. Germany will have its own Spartacist communist uprising in 1919. They feel, the German powers that be, feel like it's sending a virus into Russia to take it out of the war. And Lenin is a leading Bolshevik, and again, he is against the war, so their hope is that he will either disrupt the country or take control of the country and take it out of the war. And this will also relate to some later accusations, which come in this picture here, where you can see Kaiser Wilhelm II scheming in the background with the Bolsheviks with their purse of German money, and they are forcing their will upon the Russian people and Russia. And the caption from this British magazine is "Betrayed." Now, in terms of the April thesis, we can see here that Lenin, and these are parts from it, there's no support for provisional government. You can read the details about the utter falsities of all its promises should be made clear, particularly those relating to the renunciation of annexations, exposure in places of the impermissible, illusion-breeding demand that this government, a government of capitalists, should cease to be an imperialist government. Elsewhere in the April thesis, you can see that he says that there's a recognition of the fact in most of the Soviet workers' deputies of our party is in a minority and is against the party of all petty bourgeois opportunists. The masses must be made to see that the Soviet workers' deputies are the only possible form of revolutionary government. And as long as we are in the minority, he's saying at the last sentence here, we carry on the work of criticizing, exposing errors at the same time as we preach the necessity of transferring the entire state power to the Soviet of Workers' deputies so that the people may overcome their mistakes by experience, or all power to the Soviets. And then finally, there are other clauses that deal with banking, another one that deals with the imperialistic war. 6 deals with the fact of landed estates. They're going to confiscate all the landed estates. There's going to be nationalization of all lands in the country. The land to be disposed by the local Soviets of agricultural laborers and peasants' deputies. So again, he's saying bread, peace, and land. This is the land part of it. He's not saying exactly how it's going to happen, but he's making a promise to those peasants that they will get land. And his return to Russia, he was worried he might be arrested. Instead, there was a crowd greeting him as a savior. But remember, the Bolsheviks are still not in the majority in the revolutionaries at this time. So, overthrow the provisional government and the Bolsheviks. Conditions we're looking at. There's profound disillusionment with the provisional government. There's the worsening of conditions in Russia through 1917 that we've spoken about. Remember, the Bolsheviks are only about 25,000 in February 1917, and they're only 40 of 1,500 members of the Petrograd Soviet. Then Lenin returns in April. He stops people like Stalin cooperating with the provisional government. Stalin was already in the country. There are going to be changes over this time. The Bolshevik membership is going to grow as people lose faith in the provisional government. Trotsky, in fact, will change from being a Menshevik to being a Bolshevik and now being in favor of active revolution. Another hitch or change is that the July days, the Bolsheviks troops refused to go to the front, and then they joined 250,000 protesters, which means that the Soviets get blamed, the Bolsheviks get blamed for the uprising. Trotsky's arrested, later released. The Bolsheviks are banned. Lenin flees. This is in contrast to, say, Castro, who turns himself in. The Bolsheviks are linked to the Germans by Kerensky with some letters he reveals, so we're going back to that cartoon we saw. However, the Bolsheviks are not stopped. They held a secret conference in Petrograd, and then in August, they were asked to help save the provisional government from Kornilov's coup. Once now that they're an established party again, the Bolsheviks gain the majority of the executive committee of the Petrograd Soviet. And remember, that's the body that represents the workers and the soldiers, and with Order Number 1, in a sense, controls the military. So now they've got control of that. Lenin then pushes for an October Revolution in the name of protecting the Soviet from outside forces such as the Provisional Government and what Kornilov did. Trotsky creates the Military Revolutionary Committee in preparation for the coup, and then, as you've read in the reading, the Provisional Government begins to move against the Bolsheviks, and in that way, in a sense, triggers the counter move by the Bolsheviks to finally take power. On October 25th, the Bolshevik units and their supporters from the Soviet forces seized the Winter Palace and disposed the government in a coup. Here are some dramatic pictures of it from the time of communism in Russia. You can see two of the workers here, one a soldier, one likely a Bolshevik here with his red armband, and here they are storming the palace. Remember, more bullets get put in the palace during the shooting of the movie by Eisenstein than the actual attack. Next presentations I'll be preparing. What are the interpretations of historians? What roles did Lenin and Trotsky play in this takeover of power? And there'll be an additional presentation as I take you through just the details of the Provisional Government in images and sort of short snapshots up to its fall.